I remember standing in front of that house for more than 20 minutes, just standing, frozen. It was 1956, and I had just returned from Korea, a war I volunteered for, serving as a U.S. Army radio technician during one of the most complicated, overlooked conflicts of our time. I hadn't written, I hadn't called, I just showed up, with a wooden box tucked under my arm. Inside were the only pieces of my life that still felt real. A faded photograph, a letter I never found the courage to send, and a medal I never showed to anyone. The street hadn't changed. Same cracked sidewalk, same sycamore tree at the corner. Her house looked untouched by time, neatly trimmed bushes, white shutters. The front porch light still burned even in the afternoon. But I couldn't move. She lived there. Emily, the girl who'd walked with me through summer rains and wartime fears. The one I wrote poems for but never read them aloud. I loved her. I still did. But I never rang the doorbell. I remember thinking, if she had moved on, if there were children inside, a husband, a new life, I couldn't show up like some ghost from the past. I was thinner, older, half deaf from a blast I couldn't forget. I barely recognized myself in the mirror. What right did I have to knock? But maybe the bigger truth was, I was afraid, not of rejection, of recognition, of seeing something in her eyes that said, "You came too late." So I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I walked to the garden, her garden, the one she'd once called her sanctuary. I got down on my knees and gently buried the medal in the soil beneath her hydrangeas. The medal I'd received from a South Korean officer, unofficial, unrecorded, for helping save civilians by relaying a broken signal in time. It didn't belong in a drawer. It belonged there, with her. Then I walked away. I didn't look back. It would take over 30 years before I learned what really happened after I left, because that medal didn't stay buried forever. And somehow, in ways I still can't explain, it told her everything I never had the guts to say. If this story touches you the way it haunted me to write it, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing real stories that move, heal, and surprise. And now, buckle in, because what happens next will change everything. Emily and I grew up on the same block in a little town outside Rochester, New York. We were the kind of kids who didn't need many words. We shared comic books, ice cream cones, and long walks to nowhere in particular. Her dad was a mailman who whistled when he walked. My dad worked long hours, fixing carburetors in a dusty shop that smelled like grease and coffee. We fell in love quietly. The kind of love that grows in glances, in afternoons on porch steps, in the way someone says your name when no one else is around. I was 21 when I signed up. The war in Korea wasn't something I rushed into. But the headlines started to blur together. Communist forces advance. US advisors needed. Volunteers requested. I told myself I was doing my part. I thought I'd be gone for a year, maybe less. I was trained as a field radio operator. No combat, just tech. Safe, they said. Emily didn't protest. She kissed me gently the night before I left, gave me a folded note and said, "Don't lose this." Inside was a photo of us taken at a summer picnic. She'd written on the back, "If you still believe in this, when you return, ring the doorbell." I carried that photo in my breast pocket the entire deployment, but nothing prepared me for what I saw. Radio tech might sound simple, but out there in the frozen mountains and muddy valleys of Korea, I was a lifeline. My hands shook every time I tapped out coordinates. Each signal sent could mean supplies, air support, or silence, and death. I saw soldiers cry for their mothers. I saw friends disappear in clouds of mortar smoke. One night, I relayed a signal in a blind storm, ended up saving over 80 civilians caught between crossfire and an airstrike. I only found out later. The South Korean unit commander handed me a small medal before disappearing into the chaos. I never learned his name. That medal, tucked away with Emily's photo, came to mean more than anything I ever earned. But as the war dragged on, letters stopped arriving. My own voice began to fade. I lost part of my hearing in a shell blast in late 1953. I spent months in a military hospital, numb, dizzy, lost. They patched up my body, but my mind had wandered far beyond anything they could fix. I stopped writing home. I told myself it was better this way. She was young, beautiful. Maybe she'd moved on. And if she had, wasn't that the right thing? After my release, I was processed out with a batch of non-essential returnees. No parades, no military honors, just a handshake and a ticket back to New York. They didn't even log our names properly. In the official books, it was as if we never served. I arrived home in a different season than I'd left. Snow on the ground, sky dull and endless. My duffel bag slung over my shoulder, my hearing muffled in one ear like the world was speaking through glass. And still, I went back to that street. It looked the same. Her house stood at the corner like a memory refusing to fade. The white trim was brighter than I remembered. The hydrangeas were blooming despite the cold. I held that photo tight in my pocket and stepped closer. That's when I heard it, children laughing inside. A woman's voice. It could have been her. Maybe it was. Maybe not. I stood at the edge of the yard, my boots sinking into the damp earth, and I thought about that note. If you still believe in this when you return, ring the doorbell. But what if I didn't believe in myself anymore? What if I was just a shell of who I'd been? So instead, I pulled out the medal. I crouched near the garden bed and without a word, dug into the dirt beneath the hydrangeas. I placed the medal there, wrapped in a small cloth, covered it, stood up and walked away. Not a word spoken, not a knock, just silence. That was the first time I buried my past, not on a battlefield, but in her garden. And for years I told no one. When I stepped off the train in New York, there were no flags, no handshakes, no signs with my name on them, and no one standing on the platform to remind me that I had ever left home as anything other than another face in a uniform. It felt as if I had vanished into a war that no longer mattered and returned to a country that barely remembered it had sent me there at all. I didn't expect a parade. Not for someone like me, not for a radio technician whose contributions weren't written in headlines or marked by medals pinned in public ceremonies, but in whispers, relayed coordinates, and lives saved in silence. And yet the absence of even a simple welcome back stung in a way I wasn't ready for. Because while I had come home with 2 feet and a beating heart, buried inside me the quiet devastation of a man who had been forgotten before he'd even been remembered. I stayed in Rochester for only a few days, just long enough to realize that everything I had once known had either changed entirely or remained so painfully familiar that it hurt to look directly at it. The soda shop where Emily and I used to split milkshakes had become a vacant building with peeling paint, and the elm trees we carved our initials into had been trimmed down to stumps after a windstorm took out half the block. And yet, even with all that change and all that silence, some part of me, the stubborn, reckless, still young part, pulled me toward her street, as if my boots had memorized the route without asking my permission. And before I even realized what I was doing, I was standing on the sidewalk across from the house I had memorized, down to the smallest detail. The chipped corner of the step, the brass mailbox that caught the sun just right, and the garden, of course, her garden, wild with hydrangeas, just as she always wanted. There were toys in the yard, tiny bicycles resting on their sides like sleeping dogs, and somewhere behind the screen door, I heard the high, light sound of a child's laughter, mingling with the familiar cadence of a woman's voice. And in that moment, I couldn't breathe, because part of me wanted, so desperately, to believe it was her voice, that this was still her house, her life, that I had come. Back in time, not too late, not forgotten, but another part of me, the heavier, quieter part, the one that had lived through too many close calls and sat through too many sleepless nights in field hospitals, with only my thoughts for company, whispered that I had no place here anymore, not as I was, not as a stranger in my own story, not as a broken version of the boy she had once loved. I held the wooden box tighter in my arms, the one I had carried all the way from Korea, across oceans and silence and guilt, and inside it, carefully wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was the medal I had received from a South Korean commander, a man who barely spoke English, but whose eyes told me that what I had done, the message I had relayed in a storm that night, had saved people, had mattered, even if no one in my country would ever record it. That medal, like so much of what I carried, was not meant to be seen or displayed. It was a secret, a confession, a relic of a moment that had no witness. And now, standing before the garden that had once been a promise, I knew I could not walk up those steps and ring the bell, as if the years had not passed, as if I had not vanished, as if she had not rebuilt her life without the boy who never came back. So I walked across the yard without hesitation, not because I had found courage, but because I had none left to lose, and I knelt beside the hydrangeas, brushing away the leaves and the soft, damp earth, and I buried the medal beneath the roots of the flowers she loved, not as a gift, but as a message, as a truth I couldn't speak out loud, as the only piece of myself I felt worthy of leaving be. And then I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands and walked away, the sound of the screen door creaking behind me, never coming, no footsteps chasing, no voice calling my name, just the quiet rhythm of my breath and the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I disappeared down the sidewalk, becoming once again the man no one saw return. I never spoke about that day to anyone, not in letters, not in conversation, not even to myself, because admitting it would mean admitting that I had given up, that I had surrendered not on the battlefield, but in the place that mattered most, the threshold of the life I was too afraid to reclaim. Years later, when I met Mary and we settled into a quiet life in Detroit, she a school librarian, I a mechanic at a local shop, I never told her about Emily, or the box, or the garden, or the medal still buried beneath the flowers that, in my mind, never stopped blooming. Mary didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers, and in the silence between us grew something that resembled peace, not happiness, not passion, but a kind of shared understanding that some lives are built not on what is spoken, but on what is endured. Life, after the war, didn't begin again so much as it resumed in a kind of hush, like the quiet after a storm that leaves everything standing but rearranged, as if someone had come through while you were gone and moved the furniture of your soul without leaving a note behind. In Detroit, I found work quickly, not because I was exceptional at what I did, but because I was steady, reliable, the kind of man who showed up early, kept his head down, and didn't ask for much. And in a city that thrived on rhythm and repetition, I fit in like a missing cog, finally snapped into place. I took a job at a small garage on the west side, the kind of place where time smelled like oil and old rubber, where the only music was the low murmur of engines and the occasional crackle of a baseball game on the radio. I rented a modest apartment above a dry cleaner, and for a while I convinced myself that routine was enough, that the absence of pain was the closest thing to peace I would ever know. Then I met Mary. She wasn't like Emily. Mary was quiet in a way that didn't ask for attention, a school librarian who wore her hair pinned up with a pencil, spoke softly, and carried herself like someone who had long ago accepted the life she was given, not because it fulfilled her, but because she believed, like many women of her time, that endurance was a kind of love. We met by chance, both reaching for the same bag of flour at the corner market, and from there our lives folded into one another, not with passion, but with mutual agreement. We married 6 months later, not because of whirlwind romance or sleepless nights of longing, but because we both needed someone to sit across from at breakfast, someone to ask if the heater was making that noise again, someone to share the slow turning of the calendar with. And I never told her about Emily. Not once, not even when we lay side by side in the dark, and she asked, gently, where I had gone during the war, or why I sometimes cried in my sleep, or what the box was that I kept locked in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, like a secret I was too tired to protect. She never pushed, I never explained, and in that unspoken agreement we built a quiet sort of companionship, Not quite intimacy, but something close enough that it passed for love on good days and for silence on the rest. We didn't have children. We tried early on, but something in me, something broken or buried too deep, never allowed that part of life to take root. And when the final doctor told us gently that it probably wouldn't happen, Mary simply nodded, stood up, and began watering the plants in our kitchen window as if nothing had changed. Still, every June, without fail, something inside me would stir. A pull behind the ribs, a pressure I couldn't explain, and I'd tell Mary I needed a few days, that I had to take care of something back home, though she never asked what or why, and I would board a Greyhound bus and ride through the soft hills of upstate New York all the way to Rochester, to the same street, the same corner, the H.M. house. I never got off the bus. I would sit by the window, heart pounding like it used to before a night mission, and watch her house drift into view like a dream too bright to stare at directly. And every year, I told myself this would be the time, that I would knock on the door, that I would finally explain, finally say what I had never said, but I never did. I watched the garden instead. The hydrangeas were always there, taller now, more unruly, as if they had grown from the memory I left beneath them rather than the soil, blooming wild and full like they knew I was watching. Sometimes I imagined her standing there, older now, watering the roots, perhaps brushing her hand through the leaves and wondering if she had imagined that moment all those years ago, the one where she saw someone at the edge of her yard, not quite a stranger, not quite a ghost. I'd ride the bus back the same day, watching the road wind away from her house like a thread I'd never followed. And when I returned home, Mary would be waiting with a cup of coffee and a quiet nod, as if she knew somehow that whatever I was searching for out there wasn't ready to be found. Years passed, decades. The box remained in the drawer. The medal remained in the soil. And I remained caught between two lives, the one I lived in silence and the one I had buried like a promise in someone else's garden. It was the spring of 1989 when the past finally found me, not with a knock at the door or a voice calling my name, but in the quiet shuffle of the morning mail, a stack of bills and catalogues, coupons I'd never use, and tucked between it all, a plain white envelope with no return address, no stamp, just my name written across the front in careful, slanted handwriting I didn't recognize, yet I felt I'd seen before in another life, on a different kind of envelope. I opened it slowly, already breathless, the way a man opens something that might change everything, and inside I found a photograph, one I knew instantly, one that hadn't been in my drawer in years, one that should have never left that garden, a photograph of me and Emily, the same one I had given her before I shipped out, the same one I buried along with the medal beneath her hydrangeas wheat heap. Here now, creased at the corners, but unmistakably real. There was also a newspaper clipping, folded carefully, yellowed with time, the headline printed in modest bold, "Medal found in garden sparks mystery, memories." And beneath it a photo, not of us, not of the house, but of the medal itself, still wrapped in that same handkerchief, still carrying the dirt of the garden where I left it like an unanswered prayer. There was no signature on the letter, but there was a note, handwritten, thoughtful, full of pauses where emotion must have stopped the pen, from someone who introduced himself only as Emily's grandson, who explained that she had passed away a few weeks earlier, peacefully in her home, after years of tending the same garden, caring for the same hydrangeas, and living in the same house I had known. Ver dared to re-enter. He told me that she never married, that she lived alone for most of her life, that every June she would stand by the garden for long minutes, sometimes an hour, watering the flowers with quiet hands and wet eyes, and that sometimes she would take out an old photo, the one of the two of us beneath the elm, and hold it close like it contained the sound of a voice she never stopped listening for. He said she never spoke much about the war, never explained why she never remarried, never answered questions about a medal or a letter, but that she had once whispered, barely audibly, that sometimes silence was the clearest way to say, "I remember." He'd found the medal by accident, while helping clear the garden beds, struck by the weight of it, the way it had been wrapped with care, the engraving still legible. And when he turned it over, he found the words I had scrawled in a moment of fear and love all those decades ago, for Emily, for all I didn't live but felt. Those words, he said, changed everything. He went looking for me through old directories, church bulletins, local records, piecing together fragments until he found a name, a city, a shop, and finally, an address. And even though he didn't know for sure if I was the same man, he sent the letter anyway, hoping, I suppose, that the past was still listening. I sat with that letter for hours. I read it over and over, tracing the photograph with trembling fingers, the edges damp from tears I hadn't planned to shed, my heart racing with the ache of 1,000 unanswered questions and 1,000 more that somehow had just been answered. She knew. All this time, she had known. She had found the medal. She had read the inscription. And even though I never rang the doorbell, even though I never spoke the words I meant to say, even though I had buried my truth in the earth and walked away without so much as a goodbye, she heard me. Every year, every summer, every bloom. And now, even after she was gone, her grandson had passed it back to me, the medal, the message, the memory, as if time itself had reached into the soil and said, "It's not too late. She heard you. The medal is back with me now." It rests on my nightstand in a small wooden frame beside the photo we took on that summer afternoon, the one where she's smiling at me like she already knew we'd be separated by more than time. And the letter I never mailed, the one whose words I rewrote again and again in my mind, but never had the courage to send. It's tarnished now, the medal. The colors have faded, and the edges have worn soft, but in that metal lies everything I could never say. The weight of silence, the cost of waiting, the gravity of a promise kept in the most fragile way possible. Sometimes, in the early hours before sunrise, when the world is still and my thoughts are louder than I'd like, I run my fingers across its surface and wonder what would have happened if I'd knocked. If I'd taken those last 3 steps to the porch, raised my hand and pressed the doorbell like I said I would, but then I remember that she knew. I remember that she stood by those flowers year after year, holding our photograph, her silence speaking louder than any words ever could. And I understand now that love, real love, doesn't always need a grand return, a reunion at the door, a final kiss beneath the porch light. Sometimes love is a seed buried in fear, watered by memory, and left to bloom in the quiet corners of the world where no one is watching. And sometimes, even when we don't say it out loud, someone hears us anyway. I drive by that house now and then, though someone else lives there now. A family with bikes on the porch and laughter in the yard. And I don't stop, I don't stare, but I slow down just enough to see the hydrangeas. They still grow, thick and wild, pressing against the fence as if they've been listening all these years. And I like to think that's what she left me. Not just a memory, not just a garden, but a place where the past was never buried, just waiting to be found. So no, I never rang the doorbell. But in the end, she heard me anyway. If this story moved something inside you the way it did in me, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing these real stories of love, war, silence, and everything we carry between. We publish new stories every week, true, heartfelt, unforgettable.